everybody. We're going to kick off again now. This is the Climate Change and Forced Displacement panel. I'll hand over to Lizzie, who's chairing.
Hi, everyone. I'm Elizabeth. I'm a fundraising officer here at SolidariTee, and I'm delighted to be chairing this panel today. Joining me in person, obviously, will be Yumna Kamel, and online we have Sangeetha Iengar, who you should hopefully be able to see. There she is, brilliant. So it's going to be the three of us. I'll just introduce the panelists. So firstly, we have Yumna is the co-founder and executive director of Refugee, which is a legal think tank dedicated to climate migrants. The organisation works to fill the gap in protections for communities displaced by climate, whilst providing context about this underreported issue for a wider audience. Yumna is also the legal education officer at the London-based NGO Right to Remain. Sangeetha is an award-winning human rights barrister, international development consultant, TEDx speaker, and advocate specialising in asylum, immigration, and international human rights law. She has particular experience working with vulnerable clients in her domestic practice, from representing unaccompanied children to victims of torture and trafficking and those suffering from complex mental health problems. She has also spent several years on the front line, advising governments of fragile states and parties transitioning from conflict. So just to start off, I'm thinking climate migration is becoming more and more of an issue, but it remains little understood. So for all of us here who might know stuff about other different types of migration, could we start back at the basics and give a brief introduction to the issue of climate migration, such as who it affects, how it affects them, and why? And we'll start with Yumna, and then Sangeetha, you can just follow straight on.
Okay, hello. Okay, I've never used a microphone before. Firstly, hi Sangeetha, it's nice to meet you. Secondly, thanks so much for having me. Okay, so climate displacement or climate migration occurs when climate factors, either on their own or paired with another element, make someone have to leave their home. It's happening worldwide, so both in the global north and in the global south. And it has many shapes and forms, and there are different elements. So for instance, people could temporarily flee their home. Those on the West Coast in the United States, when there are wildfires or floods, flee perhaps temporarily to another town. So that's internal displacement. And then there are now trends of cross-border displacement. In terms of who is most affected, it's typically communities that are already marginalized. So either by poverty, discrimination, or a combination of both. And the issue is that it's been happening for a while. It's continuing to happen. It's not something novel. But the issue is that it's getting worse, and there aren't any specific legal protections for those fleeing climate factors, unlike those fleeing war or persecution. In terms of the numbers, there's sort of a wide trajectory for how many people are fleeing. But a pretty solid statistic is that in 2019, an individual was 3 times more likely to be fleeing climate factors than war or persecution, which is an absolutely flooring figure. And even more shocking when you think of the fact that there are no frameworks there to protect them or sort of provide a buffer to the difficulty of having to flee. And why it's affecting them, well, there are all sorts of elements that contribute, largely corporate activity, rising temperatures. And in terms of why marginalized people are most affected, it's typically because there's less sturdy infrastructure to protect them. Their livelihoods are centered around things that are tied to land, so rural farming, fishing, so on and so forth, and so that makes for a move to sort of more urban areas. And I'll leave it there as a brief intro.
Brilliant, thank you. Sangeetha, can we come to you?
Thanks so much. Thanks, Yumna. And hi, everyone. Thanks so much for having me. I'm so sorry I couldn't be there in person. I am beaming to you live from India, which is one of the countries most affected by climate-linked migration, so it seems quite relevant. just to complement what Yumna has very helpfully laid out already, I suppose what I could do is zoom out a bit and paint you a picture in numbers. Today, 1% of the world is a barely livable hot zone. By 2070, so when you are all nearing retirement, that will go up to 19%, so almost a fifth of the entire world, covering places that billions of people now call home. By 2100, temperatures could rise to the point that just going outside for a few hours in some parts of India would result in death. So what does that mean for human movements? It means that very soon, by 2030, 40% of city dwellers will live in slums because they have been internally displaced, as Yumna laid out. And it means a vast and unpredictable remapping of the entire world's population within our lifetime. It means human suffering on a staggering scale. And the natural movement is north. The north will remain more livable than the south. So just imagine that picture in your minds of a growing planet burgeoning in terms of population and being squeezed north by soaring temperatures. And then all the other vectors, so layer on top of that, recent extreme climate events in the West, Hurricane Katrina, which caused the evacuation and non-return of people in New Orleans, the fires we saw last summer on Turkish and Greek shores, setting those shores ablaze, shores where several of us may have been holidaying 1 year before, and images of flash flooding in Australia just last week or some days ago. So in places of potential refuge. And then overlay other factors or vectors, like the known link between global conflicts, like that in Syria, to climate change. And what we have is a global picture of desperate, erratic movement, forced displacement by the most vulnerable, and necessary, considered relocation, migration by those more able, but both forced displacement and migration due to climate change. So whether that's because of slow onset climate change, so events which unfold over months, years, maybe even decades, or rapid onset disasters in climate speak, like flooding or tropical storms, people will move. They will have to move to adapt to climate change. Some of them will want to and be able to cross a border, and that will, of course, be considered cross-border climate-linked displacement or migration. But the vast number will become internally displaced people in their home country, having to find a new life, a new community to become a part of, new livelihood, new ways of living. So it is now and will, at a much higher rate, cause people to move, and yet we have no adequate, bespoke legal framework or set of legal protections for all of these different types of people that will move as a result of this.
Fantastic. So you've picked up on a lot of different things there. You've picked up on internal and cross-border displacements, how it can intersect with different issues, and the variety of ways in which climate can affect migration kind of leads us on to think about why is there no one neat solution, legal solution that is, for climate migrants. So Sangeetha, can we start with you?
Yeah, so a term that we kind of hear bandied around a lot when we talk about this topic is climate refugee. And so the natural suggestion is, well, we need to look to the Refugee Convention, and that's where the solution will be found. But as we all know, as with all issues within migration, terminology is really key, and it becomes determinative of how exclusionary or inclusive migration policy is for a particular group of people. So widespread maligning of the word migrant with barbarism, criminality, security concerns, a social scourge, which has then allowed the UK to have migration policies like the hostile environment. So the term climate refugees, it's really popular in the media, and understandably so. Someone is needing to move for reasons related to climate change, so it's very evocative. And it immediately assumes that someone has a right to protection, whether that's moral or a legal right. And we very vividly imagine people who have suddenly had something done to them an act of God or an act of BP or Shell, not an act by their own community or by an aggressor or persecutor within their community or their state. And somehow that tends to be suggestive of a greater worthiness of protection. So climate refuge is a very easy phrase to grasp, but of course, it naturally leads us to the Refugee Convention, and that isn't legally very helpful. The legal vacuum that the Refugee Convention provides, I mean, it was created in 1951 in Europe in the wake of World War II to protect against persecution for the obvious atrocities that we saw then. And it doesn't recognize protections from climate change. So the reference to climate refuge is firstly incorrect in law, but you might be asking yourself, well, okay, let's just expand the Refugee Convention to slot in climate as an additional risk factor. And isn't that the correct place that we should all be looking to legally solve this issue? But as a practitioner, I can share some of the downsides, in my view, of trying to use or make elastic the Refugee Convention as an instrument to protect climate-displaced people. So I'll name three and why this is a vacuum. Firstly, it's very difficult on an evidential level to prove to the convention required standard that climate change alone has caused someone to cross an international border. When one is building an asylum case, one has to put together a very clear bundle of evidence to show the reason for flight. Why have we needed to flee? And that becomes very difficult when we're looking at climate change. Secondly, as we all know, our own Home Secretary and many others around the globe who aren't progressives are currently trying to dial back the protections that already exist in the Refugee Convention. It's a convention under attack, and we're trying to, in the UK, shirk responsibilities. So in my view, any attempt at renegotiating the terms of the convention, to open it up, to look at it again, to try and expand the beneficiaries under it, that international dialogue is very likely to result in a backward turn of the protections that we already have in it. It's likely to dilute what we already have rather than expand what it's designed to offer because of the nature, the temperature of this dialogue internationally at the moment. And thirdly, it gets us into a bit of a tangle. The convention requires a persecutor, someone who is causing the persecution. And that, for convention refugees, I suppose would be the state actor or the horrible evil company that is emitting the carbon. In the context of climate then, climate refugees may well be fleeing to a country, a Western European country, that is a heavy emitter of carbon. And so it's very difficult to identify who the persecutor is. The persecutor is very unlikely to be where they are fleeing from. And so it makes it very difficult to squeeze that scenario into a legal instrument that's designed for a very different purpose. So in terms of language, and language does matter, the preferred language is climate-linked migration or climate-driven displacement. In terms of legal protections, it doesn't seem really to be the place where we can find the legal solution. But when we start to examine why someone moves under climate-linked migration, we come closer to finding the right legal place or places where legal solutions might be born from. That was a long rambling spiel, so I'll let Yumna come in at this point.
That was a brilliant answer, a real crash course to sort of language when it comes to the climate migration matrix. I will add briefly to it, so I completely agree with Sangeetha, and we really do encounter difficulties when we discuss the Refugee Convention. Another reason why it might not be an immediate point of recourse is also that the majority of climate-induced displacement that's occurring now, or movement, is within borders. And in order to fit within the legal definition of a refugee, you must be fleeing from one country to another. And so that's sort of strike two, why it's not exactly appropriate. We are starting to see some cases where climate elements are involved within an asylum claim. So for instance, last year, France accepted its first ever climate refugee. But what was striking about that case is that the individual was a man from Bangladesh, and he had severe respiratory health issues. And the reason why the appeal court in Bordeaux, I think, accepted him is because his lawyer was able to paint it as persecution. He would not survive if he were returned to Dhaka, to the capital of Bangladesh, because his respiratory issues were so severe, and he would not be able to receive the required medical treatment that he needs, in conjunction with the fact that air pollution was so severe. So it wasn't a straight asylum sort of case based on climate. Health factors were involved and sort of his ability to survive. And I do think that that sort of hybrid case, it can be effective. I'm not anti-refugee convention, but I do think that A, it's sort of legally incorrect to use the term climate refugee, and also it's not a one-size-fits-all when it comes to climate migration. And quite frankly, the sort of backbending his lawyer had to do to reach that argument took up so much time. And when you consider the number of people who are fleeing and the risks they actually face, it's sort of square peg, round hole. We can't expect lawyers and litigators to spend that much time trying to create a case and trying to fit their clients within a definition that, quite frankly, is not welcoming for them. There was another point I wanted to make. When it comes to the actual elements of climate displacement, it is so different, and the ways in which it occurs are so varied across the world. And so when we think of sort of all these countries coming together and first taking the time to draft up a sort of international convention that includes a uniform definition, and we think of the amount of time it takes for them to become signatories and then to introduce that legislation into their national legislation, it would take such a long time. And we already see how, you know, there is this increasing hostility towards the definition of a refugee. I personally, and I'm not a cynic, but I personally don't think that that is the only way forward. And that's why at Earth Refuge we take a sort of local approach by consulting with affected communities and NGOs and institutions in those areas to understand what the particular needs are of the affected community, how they are being required to move, and whether movement is a last resort, whether there are other measures that can be taken to protect or adapt to climate factors, and if they do want to move, how and when. And it's important to consider sort of cultural factors when we consider, you know, multiple indigenous communities have major ties to land. And quite simply put, they don't want to move. And if we put sort of enough focus on the issue, they perhaps wouldn't have to move. You know, are there rights that are implementable against local authorities or national governments to provide funding or a certain level of protection, to provide education so that farming can become adaptable? So that when certain storms or droughts hit, farmers don't have to move to urban areas, they simply can adapt. Is there a right to sustainable housing? For instance, in Ghana. Can houses be built to, you know, withstand certain climate factors so that movement is not the first route of escape or protection? Someone fleeing rural drought and into an urban area is not the same as someone fleeing hurricanes that keep hitting the same city and who needs to move to another country entirely. So the way in which it impacts different people is different. And so we find it really important to listen to affected communities, amplify their narratives, and try and sort of meet those needs with our legal backgrounds and see if there are implementable rights from existing legal frameworks. So all of this is to say, the Refugee Convention is not ideal when it comes to addressing this issue. That doesn't mean it's an entire dead end, but it's definitely not a long-term solution. And I think that the long-term solution will have to be more customized than one uniform definition, but that's just my view and my organization's view, and we're definitely open to working with other definitions, but there you have it.
Okay, so that's a very complex picture of the legal situation for different people, different needs, different situations in terms of what climate factors are affecting them. And you talked about how both of you said that the Refugee Convention basically is potentially inadequate in terms of finding a solution. What do you think about current UK policies or policies elsewhere in the world that you think, how do you think those current policies are affecting climate migration, and how maybe could they be changed? It's quite a hard question, but can I go back to you, Yumna?
Okay.
You can just criticize policies if you want to.
I mean,
that's fine.
I'm not here to just do bashing. I think it's important to be productive when we have these conversations, because it's quite easy to point the finger and say, this issue is your fault, or you've contributed to this. How dare you? What's harder is trying to sort of more softly address accountability and encourage cooperation, because the thing about climate migration, and if any of you are Game of Thrones fans, maybe you'll understand this analogy, but climate change is an issue that affects us all. Doesn't matter about your creed, your race, your geographic location. It's happening, whether or not you want to acknowledge it. And so it really does require a cohesive effort to address, both, in terms of mitigating what's actually happening and addressing the impacts that are inevitable. Obviously, corporate activity and sort of fossil fuel use is greatly affecting the rising temperatures. And it is well documented that the majority of this activity is happening in the global north, and that its impacts are heavily felt in the global south. That's sort of an undeniable trend. What's difficult is assigning liability. So by that I mean, when you have a legal case, you have to show cause and you have to prove it in court. So you need to have evidence to show that there is a scientific or causal link between X activity on Y result on these people. That's very difficult to prove. And it's also difficult to assign responsibility to one party, because it's sort of a collaboration. And there is a principle called the polluter pays principle, whereby we assume that whoever is polluting has to pay the price. So it's difficult, as I said, to prescribe that responsibility. Hopefully we will be able to. So at Earth Refuge, we look at a multitude of cases, not necessarily linked to immigration or asylum or even environmental law, but we look at different rights that have been implemented around the world, or certain arguments that could mirror climate migration arguments, even though the facts might not be the same. And we think of how we could perhaps carry over those rights or those arguments over to climate migration cases. The reason why I give you this background is there's one case in particular that concerns whaling. It was a case before the ICJ, so the International Court of Justice. And in that case, it was established that there was basically whaling law in Japan. And what was established is that scientific evidence can be used to prove transnational accountability. What that means is scientific evidence was used to prove that country A was doing something and it had an impact on country B. And for that reason, the first country is liable. And we hope that the same sort of thing can be seen with climate migration. So if we can prove that a certain country's activities impacted another and made that population have to move or impacted their life adversely, perhaps we can use that as a protective measure. But I'll pass over to Sangeetha to speak about everything else.
I guess what I would add to that in terms of solutions, and I'm glad we're talking about that because the problem is so complicated and vast, is, as Yumna says, there are many different ways to approach finding the solution. One is to look at the polluter and then the polluter pays principle, and can we therefore litigate against that entity that is polluting? In terms of climate-induced migration, another way to find the solution is to look at the characterization of each move we discussed at the beginning that there are many different forms of movement, cross-border, internally displaced, and the drivers behind each movement is different. So different categories might be economic migrant, asylum seeker, student, family seeking to reunite. The question, why does a climate migrant have to move, throws up so many different possible answers. It sounds like quite an easy question, but if we really kind of interrogate that question, we begin to see the sheer scope of the group of people and the many different vectors that climate change interacts with to trigger movement. And those vectors help us find legal pathways for that movement. So one vector is obviously economics. Let's take Madagascar right now, suffering from severe drought, soon to be named the world's first climate change famine. Let's take a farmer in Madagascar. As that drought settles in, of course, livelihoods reduce, they become at risk and they become scarce. So if that farmer moves to resolve or try to improve their situation, are they economic migrants because they're looking for an alternative source of income? Or are they climate migrants? Legally, if they've crossed an international border to look for work, they're an economic migrant. And largely speaking, the legal frameworks don't have any way to mark out the climate change element to their movement. And in fact, it's quite interesting. One of my instructing solicitors, Ms. Rea, made a subject access request, a SAR, to the Home Office, asking a really simple question: how many people do you know who moved to the UK for climate change related reasons? And their response was, we don't record this data. So there is no record, for example, of the asylum seeker who flees because they're unable to pay a politically connected loan shark who has impunity and threatens violence. And the underlying reason for the loan is climate change, which wreaked havoc on crops and livelihoods. So, of course, it's startlingly deficient data collection, and there's a policy that we can just very quickly improve. Add that question into asylum interviews, add that question into visa application forms, which are some 40 or 50 pages. That would make it much more helpful in terms of policy making. But in terms of solutions, that vector we looked at of the Madagascan farmer, migration, climate change, and economics, there are pathways that might be made elastic to help us. A couple of years ago, I think 2020, I helped design a pilot for displaced talent visas. So people who are in displaced communities but want to move on the basis of their talent, their profession. You have accountants sitting in refugee camps in Zaatari, in Jordan, in Lesbos. How can they access the UK labour market? They can't unless they take a dinghy to come to the UK. But that displaced talent visa uses labour as a way to migrate, but recognises that they are displaced, and so they need extra support, integration, tools once they arrive, perhaps extra financial assistance, the ability to bring their family, and so on. So is that a pathway that could be created for climate-linked migration? That's in terms of sort of international cross-border movements, and there isn't one bespoke international legal framework because, as Yumna says, there is no one type of movement that one quick solution, one neat solution, as Elizabeth put it, could solve. But there are other solutions that exist. So some countries have temporary protections for people who, let's say, they're already in a host country, and whilst they're there on some form of visa, their home country gets hit by a disaster. They would then have temporary protection to stay. The case that Yumna mentioned, which I only discovered through her brilliant website, which I urge you all to look at, has this absolutely comprehensive database of climate-related litigation, was, as she said, an asylum seeker from Bangladesh who relied on his asthma and medical complaints to allow the Refugee Convention in Article 3 to fit his right to remain. But the vast numbers of people move within their own countries. So we can also look at solutions internally, so internally displaced people. And the one brilliant soft law instrument on this is the Guiding Principles on Internally Displaced People. It's not legally binding, it is soft law, but it sets out how people's rights are protected when they're displaced within their own countries. And it creates a sort of refugee status of protection when they're having to move because of some sort of climate change induced event. So in terms of non-legal solutions, and Yumna laid out a few kind of adaptive measures that can be taken, there is a fantastic pilot in Bangladesh, which I haven't seen in person. Now, Bangladesh, which is a neighboring country to India where I'm now, knows that it's vulnerable to climate change. And so it has had to act. Over the last decade, I think nearly 700,000 Bangladeshis were displaced year on year by natural disasters. And what that has done is, of course, spike the population surge in slums in Dhaka, a mega city. So to come up with a solution for that, second cities have been created. It's a pilot city that I think is called Mongla. And so these are new created cities that have adaptive infrastructure, factories, employment opportunities, affordable housing, schools, hospitals, and crucially offer integration packages to those who are internally displaced and have lost their livelihoods. So those who are living in coastal regions that are prone to flooding, and that's only getting worse year on year, now have an alternative place that they can move within Bangladesh, be supported to find a community, to find affordable housing, and to find a way to make a living. And that pilot so far has been a roaring success. In the last 5 years, the population has jumped, I think, 60%. So these solutions seem to come most from countries that are most vulnerable to climate change. And they're being created in silo. So what would be really helpful is for the legal and non-legal solutions to be kind of showcased and then scaled up. There's no reason that satellite cities for IDPs couldn't be used elsewhere, couldn't be used in neighboring India, but there isn't that knowledge sharing yet. So there are a few solutions, and the big legal instrument that I would champion as a solution would be, as I say, the guiding principles on internally displaced people. And what we can all do is really urge that our government champions the use of those principles. You asked us, the UK, what's it doing for this issue? It's obviously not a country that naturally hosts many climate-linked migrants, because of course people tend to take the cheapest, easiest and shortest journey to rebuild their lives. And that usually means staying in their own country or crossing over to a neighboring country. Our immediate neighbors are wealthy Northern European countries who have the resources to invest in creating the protections that people need. But where the UK can really champion support for climate-induced migration is talking about the guiding principles on internal displacement, creating a humanitarian visa that has temporary protection, really improving the conversation on the international scale. COP26 was a huge opportunity for that. It was a failed opportunity, but there's still room for all of us to urge our government to try and take this agenda forwards, to use pilots like the Displaced Talent Visa and showcase those pilots to the rest of the international community.
Fantastic. I really like that you've both highlighted legal and non-legal solutions there. And you both mentioned as well that it's important to think about local knowledge and initiatives coming from countries themselves. But I think I'm conscious of time and I want to have, there's so many questions I'd love to keep asking you, but I think people will definitely have questions because this is such an interesting issue. So if anyone has questions, can they pop their hand up and I will ask them? Yes, go ahead. You can, do you want to come up and say it? You don't have to, but.
Yeah, I think, I'm just going to sit down. I think you both pointed out importantly that climate-related displacement or migration is very much something that affects countries and people both in the global south and the global north. I think I am correct in believing that the mainstream discourse still thinks that it's a developing countries issue. So it's these depictions of, waves of climate refugees all coming to the north, and which is mostly true. But I mean, if you look at places like London, there's already communities in Newham or in Canvey Island that are often marginalized, but that already experience evacuations or displacement based on flooding, based on, on the south coast of England, there's villages that are being decommissioned and people are being displaced in that way. And I think my question relates mostly to you because you said that you, with your NGO, you work with communities to see the needs that they have. So my question is, how do you work with communities that might not necessarily identify themselves as being climate displaced, because they often see, for instance, themselves as victims of urban infrastructures not being like that, they're being excluded from urban transformation and stuff like that, and that they don't necessarily see themselves as victims of climate change. So how can we kind of break this idea that there's definitely also communities in London, in developed places that, also are climate change displacees, and Sorry, that was very rambly.
No, excellent question.
So just to sum up, you're asking how, wow, I'm so impressed with your knowledge. It's so nice to meet someone who actually has researched the topic. Secondly, just to sum up, so your question is, how do you work with communities who wouldn't necessarily refer to themselves as climate migrants or sort of victims of climate events, correct?
Yeah, and also like how can it, if we kind of actively work towards breaking this idea that only people in Bangladesh or stuff are climate displaced, how can we do that also at a UK government level, right?
Okay, so I'm going to do a bit of a self-plug for Earth Refuge. So this is why my co-founder, Stephanie, who happens to be my best friend, and I founded Earth Refuge in December of 2020. I have an immigration law background, and she has an environmental law background. And during the pandemic, the opportunity arose for us to start a project together. And we selected climate migration because we had one very brief seminar on it, but it was mainly through a human rights lens, not a legal lens. And when we thought of a project, we thought, okay, we both know a bit or enough about each of these topics to sustain a project and to begin one. Wrong way around. So when we started doing further research, we realized the numbers, but we also realized that this is an issue that's on everyone's doorstep, right? It doesn't matter if you are marginalized, if you are brown, if you are black, if you live in New York, or if you live in Kiribati. And we also realized that it wasn't being discussed. So when we first started the organization, I set up my Google alerts for climate migration and climate displacement and all of this stuff. And for the first 3 months, all I was getting was articles about monarch butterfly migration, not humans. And so that's what fueled sort of how our organization has been shaped. So our central aim is to address this legal vacuum through local solutions that are not we're not sort of up ourselves. We don't sort of go up to a community and say, you know what, we have legal backgrounds and we know what's best for you. You are a climate migrant and you have to move. We sort of hope we're taking a more nuanced approach. But the second aim is to encourage dialogue and to encourage education for everyone about this topic. So not just people with legal backgrounds, but lay people, activists, students, so on and so forth. And that's why we have a community. So we have our legal solutions and we have a community at Earth Refuge. And the purpose of that is, sorry, conscious of time, to put a face to the name. So we conduct interviews with affected communities. So we have a team of correspondents who either go out or, pandemic allowing, just have Zoom interviews with members of affected communities, their leaders. And we try and have a focus on indigenous leaders, for instance, in Alaska and in Kiribati. And sort of the people who are on the ground trying to help them, so wildfire fighters. I think it's really important to raise awareness for the issue for people who are not yet experiencing it, so like yourselves. and to say, you know, this exists. But I think it's really important to have a sort of an approach that encompasses more humility when you're approaching a community that actually is experiencing it. You can't say, you know, you're experiencing climate factors and therefore you are a climate migrant. And we worked with an indigenous community in Ecuador, in a town called Pucayacu. And we have a podcast on it called Riskland, which I really encourage you to listen to. Sorry, even another plug. But it's really interesting because it's a tiny community, and they are very closely linked to the river that they live next to. And it keeps overflowing and causing displacement, ruining businesses, ruining homes, and even causing death. And yet, most of the inhabitants don't want to leave. They do not see themselves as climate migrants. And they have already made a move, a lot of them, from other regions that are sort of more poor or that have been affected by other climate factors into this community. So another thing I forgot to say is we have an archive where people who have experienced climate migration or who are interested in it write pieces. And Lexi, who is on your board, is our editor-in-chief. So if you are interested in learning more or in contributing, then please speak to her. She's the best ambassador. And it just is a place to learn more, to raise more awareness for the issue, and also to help in any way, in a small way, even if it's, you know, a little way, if it counts.
Perfect. We can put these links online so that people can have access to them. Can I have any other questions? You've got two from the live stream. Okay. Do you want to go with you first? Okay. Do you want to? Yeah.
Hi, Sangeetha. Our first question is for you, and it says, would you say the evidential barrier to classifying someone as a climate refugee could be improved by a better global understanding of the devastation of climate change? Or is it an entirely different legal framework more productive for climate displacement? Thank you.
That's a great question. The evidential burden in terms of all asylum claims in the UK is currently under attack right now by our current government. So hoping that none of those proposals come through. I think, of course, we need to be raising awareness of this issue. It's not really talked about enough. We all can, once we hear these terms of climate migration, climate refugee, we can imagine what it involves. But as the other person who asked a question said, we tend to assume it's someone in Bangladesh and not actually someone whose house was completely inundated last summer with the floods in West Germany, or communities in Newham who are having to be rehoused. And so we don't really, I think, perhaps even those of us working in this space, can understand the sheer scale of the problem. Whilst awareness raising and making sure that our judiciary, our representatives, our government knows that this is a live topic and that this is something that has to be considered, my view as a practitioner is still that it doesn't fit into the Refugee Convention, because for the Refugee Convention, as I said earlier, you have to be fleeing persecution. And there has to therefore be a persecutor. And if that persecutor is, I think I gave the example of a loan shark who is linked to the state and is threatening to inflict violence because you borrowed money in order to remedy your own situation because of droughts that had affected your farms, then perhaps that string, that thread of a story I could put before a bench. But the sort of flooding, the sort of kind of rapid onset climate disasters that we see, it would be very difficult to identify a persecutor, to fall into a particular social group, and to make the components of the Refugee Convention fit. The case that we were talking about, the appeal case from Bordeaux, he won on Article 3 grounds. So it was an asylum seeker who raised an asylum claim. And parallel to the asylum claim also said, look, I can't go back to Bangladesh, but that's also because I'm an asthmatic. And so for medical reasons, if I was sent back, I would suffer from irreversible health deterioration that would irreversibly cause a health decline, and that would be fatal to me. And he succeeded on the Article 3 ground. Now, those are arguments that you might naturally bring with your refugee claim, but I can't see how generally using the Refugee Convention would help people who are in need of moving because of climate-induced displacement. That's not to say that we shouldn't be telling the whole world about this problem. We absolutely need to be raising this issue. It's only becoming worse. And the picture I painted before is stark and startling, and we are absolutely not impervious to it just because we're sitting in urban cities that are wealthier and might have better flood prevention mechanisms in place. So we certainly need to raise awareness. And I'm hoping that by raising awareness, other judicial bodies that might use other legal instruments can start to become more fluid, and we could use those instruments. So another case is, which was reported to the UN Human Rights Council, involved an asylum seeker from Kiribati who's in New Zealand. And he said, look, I can't go back because Kiribati is going to go under within 10 years. There's an IPCC report that says that and confirms it. New Zealand rejected the claim, he was sent back. The UN Human Rights Council, the charter bodies, said that removal back was not unlawful, but it did acknowledge that climate change could be a reason that would affect someone's right to life. So in that case, he was using a covenant right, the Article 6 right to life. And so in that way, I think there are more suitable legal instruments that I deploy in litigation and can then lean on comments like the one from the Human Rights Council rather than the Refugee Convention, because the first thing the judge would say would be, okay, so the Home Office said you can't have asylum because you don't fall into a particular social group and you can't identify a persecutor. So are you bringing any other grounds? What are your other grounds of appeal? So my view is that the Refugee Convention has a very specific role to play. We need it. We need it not to be diluted or dialed back. So let's try and use other instruments that are more specifically targeting the problems that this issue causes. And also, of course, I would look at the guiding principles on internally displaced people as well. I hope that answers the question. I seem to be rambling rather away from the start.
No, that was great, thank you, and makes a lot of sense. Our next question is from Lauren Grant from Earth Refuge herself, and it's for both of you, but maybe we could start with Yumna. It says, according to the IPCC, climate change impacts contribute to stresses on community cohesion, amplified poverty, economic duress, and diminished abilities to diffuse tensions that fuel violent conflict and persecution-related human mobility, especially in fragile states. How do you make sense of the legal vacuum bearing in mind these multi-causalities for the purposes of persecution-driven displacement? Do their compounding nature change anything about the terms of debate on the applicability of current legal protection frameworks? Woo!
Thanks, Lauren. This is so classic you. It's a great question. Okay, to summarize. Potential climate conflict definitely plays a role in this sort of future matrix we're looking at. And it's difficult because you see larger, more powerful states getting involved. So for instance, in Kiribati, because climate change is so drastically affecting the community, they are looking, well, different presidents have different approaches. But there are very high inclinations of China getting involved and providing investment to, aid movement or to aid infrastructure. And it's controversial because it sort of plays to the power balance or imbalanced imbalance of power. I think something that's also key to take note of when we're thinking about community cohesion, which Lauren referenced, and this is linked and important when we're considering this context, but it's not directly linked, and that is the erasure of culture. So when you think of indigenous communities who are tied to the land, and you think of how climate change is so rapidly impacting their communities. So, for instance, there is an upcoming case before the UN Human Rights Commission. It's called Billy et al., and it's a good case to keep an eye out for. But what it sort of centers around is a group of Torres Strait Islanders. And their culture is very closely tied to the land. So, for instance, the burial sites of ancestors are now being washed away by the tide. Animals that are very closely linked to spiritual practices are dying out. And so they brought a case against the Australian government for failing to protect their community against climate change. And obviously there is a lot of pushback from mainstream media and other people and the sort of majority. And so that sort of more nuanced conflict is also really important to consider when we're thinking about climate displacement. How do we make sure that these narratives are being amplified? And how do we make sure that they're not being exploited by more powerful states or players as we move forward? And how do we also make sure, more importantly, that their culture is not erased? How do we make sure that a people is not erased from the face of the earth? I hope that directly or indirectly answers your question, Lauren.
Okay, perfect. Can we have the last question from you at the front here? Yeah, I'll pause. Yeah, perfect.
Thank you so much for such an amazing panel. I kind of wanted to ask about the UK legal framework because I work in policy and legal reform here, and I think currently it's so bleak when you're looking at Nationality and Borders Bill, and then the new Bill of Rights, and then the ouster of CART recently in the JR and Courts Bill. And I was just wondering, I think you both touched on this a bit briefly as well, but what are we seeing in terms of the potential for legal reform to do anything? And also, what are we seeing in terms of strategic litigation when all of these really small procedural mechanisms like the ouster of CART are being used in ways that most people don't even understand or know about? And how do you organize against that, both within a reform space and also in terms of community organizing outside of a legal space? I don't know if that makes sense, but just what do we do, I guess, in a UK setting when the kind of onslaught from the government against refugees of all kinds, but increasingly climate refugees as well, is relentless and feels really unstoppable? Thanks.
No, you keep yours and I'll give her back the microphone. Yeah. Also, in your answer, can you just explain, what strategic litigation is?
So great question. And it's always nice to sort of bring things home and think about what power we have. So strategic litigation is a form of sort of a claim that is brought either on behalf or in support of a community or individual, and often NGOs will get involved. So for instance, if someone's bringing a claim and then Amnesty International inserts their brief or their opinion in support of the claim or as a sort of co-claimant. And in terms of what we can do in the UK, I mean, I'm an optimist, but I'm also not naive, and it's bleak. It is bleak. And I think that's why I like to go small and start with sort of smaller impacts, and there definitely are some. So the first thing that I like to do is to tie things as closely as possible to our own lived experiences. So for instance, when there were some severe floods in the summer in London, something that many people were experiencing sort of in the heart of the city were their toilet seats exploding, from the top where the flush is. And yeah, it's not great. And that also has major health risks. And there was a flood specialist who did an article and basically explained how easy it is to stop that from happening. You buy a certain valve and you can screw it in yourself. You don't need a plumber. And so that makes it more affordable. And I didn't know that. I don't think I know anyone who knew that. And there are sort of small changes you can do by listening to flood experts, geologists, so on and so forth. And also by making things more relatable, can you grab people's attention, right? Because especially with a government like ours, it's great to link things to, you know, things that are happening to people who look like them or who have a similar background to them. So I would definitely suggest flagging this sort of thing with your MPs. Writing a letter counts. Doing little lectures or study groups with your friends also counts. Educating people, because honestly, very few people realize what climate migration is, and they also don't realize that it's happening so close to home. I know people who were displaced by the floods that were happening just north of Manchester very recently. And if there are small policy movements like that, so speaking with local authorities, speaking with your MPs, and just flagging the issue, and perhaps finding a more sympathetic member of parliament or councillor, that really does have an impact to make sort of waves, and that's how things travel up stream. And also something else to consider is, okay, if someone is a climate change denier and doesn't think it's happening, how can you make people actually acknowledge that this is an issue? And so, for instance, on the West Coast in the US, many people in California didn't think that climate change was a thing, and they didn't think it was affecting them. And only when they were impacted by wildfires a number of times in a row and had to flee their homes and realized that insurance companies had caught on and were not covering natural disasters, the tug at their pockets made them acknowledge what was happening. So I think it's really important to see what issues people are facing and see whether a neighboring community is facing something similar or whether it's impending and going to affect them soon, and sort of tug at their sympathy, but also maybe their egos. There are many sort of angles to snipe at. So that's how it would go, sort of smaller and flagging it within your community or even within your universities. Many universities are averse to introducing climate migration as a topic because they think it's so conflicted. So yeah, making impact where you are based speaks volumes.
Amazing. Okay, I think we have to end it there because I'm sure everyone wants to get to lunch. We'll reconvene at 1:30 where we'll have our second keynote from Sean Binder. Okay, enjoy lunch everyone, and thank you so much, Yumna and Sangeetha.